Well, it's that time of the week again. It's time for Chit Chat Across the Pond, and this is episode number 810 for March 4th, 2025. And I'm your host, Allison Sheridan. You know I'm not a music person, but I've invited someone named Steve Mallard onto the show to talk about a topic he's quite passionate about, and it's the evolution of music tech. Before we get started, he wants me to tell you that he is not an expert in this field, even though he does sound pretty knowledgeable. It's just he finds the history really fascinating. He probably also wants me to tell you that I strong-armed him into doing a podcast episode with me. He's been trepidatious that he could pull this off, but I know he can. Anyway, Steve and I have been friends for about 30 years, but we lost track of each other for more than 15 years, and he just recently found me. Back in the day, Steve used to sell me Sun Microsystems workstations for the large corporation where I used to work. Now, if that isn't the oddest introduction, let's just go ahead and say welcome to the show, Steve.
Hi, Al. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here. And by the way, thank you for the disclaimer. I've listened to a few of your pods, and I know you have bona fide experts on your show, and I'm not one of those. I'm much more in the enthusiastic amateur category. So thank you. I
made the big mistake of sending Steve the Andrea Ghez interview, which is the number one thing I've ever done of the coolest person that I know. And so it was, I probably should have started with some of my, normal human level interviews.
I was a little intimidated. It's true.
Well, the story of how you found me after 15 years of having lost track was a little bit interesting, I think. How did that happen?
I think you popped up as a Facebook friend recommendation. And what's interesting is I don't think you and I have any friends in common on Facebook. So I guess the algorithms somehow, I don't know, through several degrees of separation, connected us.
I think so.
And went from there.
I think that's crazy. And I hardly ever look at Facebook anyway. And I just saw a Facebook message. And boy, you send me a Facebook message, it could be 3 months until you hear from me. But I saw this one. It's like, Steve Mallard, what? So that's pretty fun. Well, anyway, Steve and I were out to lunch. And Steve Mallard started going on about a topic I said he's passionate about. And it's the history of music tech starting way back with acoustic guitars. So where do you want to start on this, Steve?
Well, I was thinking I should probably also throw one other thing into the mix, which is my background is technology, as you know, but I am also a musician of sorts. I grew up as a rock-obsessed teenager back in the UK, and this was in the era of those great 70s bands, the Led Zepps and the Pink Floyds and the Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and those kind of bands. I know you have no interest in them, Allison, but maybe some of your listeners do.
I actually went to a Pink Floyd concert when I was in college.
Did you really? I'm impressed. I never have seen the Floyd live. So you have one over me there.
I saw the pig explode and everything in Anaheim Stadium.
Okay.
So, yeah, I thought it was ridiculous and I was pretty bored. But anyway, I have been to one.
But despite having this rock obsession, I never learned to play an instrument as a kid because I was this geeky kid who spent way too much time studying for exams, and B, it just seemed way too hard. So I never got around to doing it. So a couple of years ago, I put that to rights by knuckling down and learning to play some instruments. So I started off playing guitar and struggled through that. I can play guitar now. I'd hate to say I'm any kind of master. I'm certainly no Jimmy Page or Jimi Hendrix, that's for sure. I segued across from there to play a little bit of bass guitar, tried some vocals, and most recently I've been getting into drumming in quite a big way. So as I said, I am a musician of sorts, though I do stress the of sorts, because I'm really not very good at any of those things. So I'm not likely to be playing Madison Square Garden anytime soon or a theater near you.
You do play gigs with a little band, right?
I do. I play in a couple of bands, but it's very low key. So it's basically a bunch of old people playing at being rock stars, Allison. But it's good fun. Keeps me out of trouble. But by the way, if you're interested in knowing which of those instruments I found the hardest, to my great surprise, it's drumming.
Really?
And I started off coming at that from the approach of, well, how hard can it be? It's just banging stuff, right? But then you realize there's a heck of a lot more to it than that. So I have a new appreciation of drummers who are typically the kind of laughing stock of most bands. But there's a lot more to it.
Dave Hamilton of the Mac Geek Gab is a drummer, and he was just talking about it on the Mac Geek Gab about how you have to be looking at each of your limbs as separate things that you're talking to at all times, that your right hand and your left hand are doing different things in different rhythm with your feet. And it's a very mind thing to play the drums, which I'd never thought about before. And he also talked about now he sings sometimes when he's doing it. And he had to teach his brain that his voice was a fifth limb. So he had to put it in that category to get it to coordinate and be able to sing and play drums at the same time. I'd never thought about that.
Well, firstly, he's absolutely correct. One of the first things you learn as a drummer is what they like to call limb independence, i.e., as you say, your right hand doing one thing while your left foot's doing another, and all combinations of those in between. And singing while you're drumming, I am so far away from that. I can't even sing and play guitar, and that is the easiest thing of the whole lot. But anyway, by the way, I will say that as you get older, like myself, drumming is one of the very best things you can do to fight off age-related decline, both physically and mentally. It's a heck of a workout. And it's great fun. So there you go.
I've seen Dave after playing a gig, and it's like he's just drenched in sweat. That is a great workout. Dr. Marianne Gary has been on here, and she has talked about memory. And one of the things you can do is find something that's difficult for you to do and master it. And that's one of the things that can help with age-related dementia onset. And or at least they've found correlations to that. They can't prove it's a causation yet. But one of the things she specifically described was learning to play the guitar. So I imagine the drums would be even harder. But let's turn into starting to talk about the tech here. Where did we start?
Okay, so we should probably start the story in the earlier 20th century. Probably the 1920s is a good place to go. And I'm going to start off focusing around the guitar because most of the evolution in music technology is guitar focused. So taking ourselves way back, of course, stringed instruments are nothing new. Stringed instruments have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So the thing which today we call a guitar evolved from, mandolins and lutes and all those kind of things we had many, many centuries ago. And they all had one thing in common, which is you plucked a string and it created a sound. Now, the first challenge is how do you make that sound audible to an audience? And all of those traditional stringed instruments had the concept of using resonance for amplification. So they had hollow bodies, and so the sound of the plucked string would resonate and amplify and produce some kind of volume, and that served us very, very well for hundreds and hundreds of years. But when we got to and I'd say probably the 1920s is when this became an issue. This was the era of jazz bands and swing bands and all of those kind of things. And all of a sudden, the poor guitarist is now competing with instruments like horn sections and drums, and he gets drowned out. So the challenge which then had, or she, indeed so, the challenge which had to be addressed was really one of volume. So amplification and things like microphones existed back in the 20s, but we had to find a way to apply those to the guitar in order to raise their volume to a level.
Did they start by just shoving a microphone in front of the guitar? Down near
that was the initial approach, but you have to remember back in the 1920s, microphones were pretty damn big things. So you couldn't just shove it in a guitar.
Or in front of? I was thinking
you can certainly put it in front of a guitar. The problem there is though, guitarists, we tend to move around a lot. And as the guitar moves around and moves in and out away from the microphone, it can affect the volume you're getting. So you get inconsistent kind of volumes. So I think you know where I'm going next, which is that one of the first important factors in the evolution of music tech was the development of the magnetic pickup, which was a little device which sits underneath the strings on a guitar and converts the vibration of those strings into a signal which you can then amplify. And that's how you get volume out of guitar.
Is that like a voice coil actuator, essentially, like a voice coil, like in a speaker?
Probably is, though. You probably know better than I do. I don't have your physics background, but yeah, it's a magnetic coil. Yes, indeed.
Okay,
yes.
So it's got a coil of wire and a magnet. It's moving in and out, and that's creating an electrical signal from the sort of like a reverse speaker, if you will.
I guess so. Yes, that's
Okay.
true. Yeah,
And then
say
turn that into an electrical
amplification was
signal.
already a known quantity, so it's just feeding a signal into an amplification system, and then you could finally hear the guitarist.
Okay.
So, so this was back sort of late 20s, early 30s, and
Oh,
after
wow.
that, the electric guitars as such started to evolve. One of the first things is that people realized, well, we don't need this hollow body anymore. So the purpose of the hollow body on a guitar, as I said, is resonance. It's a large echo chamber. But when you're getting the volume through the pickup, you no longer need the hollow body. And in fact, the hollow body just caused issues. It caused kind of feedback issues with the pickups. So we saw the development of what became termed solid body electric guitars. So now fast forward to the late 40s, early 50s, and this is when you have this explosion of solid body electric guitars and the creation of guitar brands, which you will still find today. So one thing I find fascinating is the three biggest selling electric guitars today here in the year 2025 are the Fender Telecaster, the Fender Stratocaster, and the Gibson Les Paul. Each of those three guitars was created in the early to mid 1950s and has barely changed in all that
Really?
time. There has been
Really?
no evolution
Interesting.
in the guitar itself.
Huh. But the technology that it uses, that it goes into, is where things have really changed?
Indeed. The evolution is really what happens after you pluck the string. The plucking of the string really hasn't changed in 60, 70 years plus. So, and there's not really much else you can do, right? You string 6 guitars and a guitar and you hit them with a pick. So, but it's what happens next is where life gets interesting.
Okay, so is that where we're going to go into changes in amplifiers?
Oh, no, this is where we get something even better than that, first of all.
Okay.
This is where when when guitars became electric, people then started figuring out, well, now I can do stuff to manipulate the sound. And by the way, you have to remember that the evolution of the solid body guitars also kickstarted the thing which today we call rock music. So rock music as an art form didn't really exist before the electric guitar in the early 1950s. So along comes the Bill Haleys of this world and the Elvis Presleys of this world. And it's also all based around electric guitars. These weren't acoustic guitar people. They were using electric guitars. And the more forward thinking of these new rock stars figured out, okay, let's play around with the sound. And the first thing they figured out was typically something called overdrive. They figured out you're plugging your guitar into an amp. If you push the amp beyond the limits of its normal operating margin, the sound breaks up. And it breaks up in a really delightful way, a really distorted, kind of gnarly way, which gives a kind of edge to your music. And so overdriven, distorted music was one of the first guitar effects in the late 50s, early 1960s. And that was just the start of things.
You know, coming from an ear that the brain that doesn't enjoy music, but an ear that prefers acoustic guitar, this description really resonates, if you could take that pun. So they're doing it on purpose. They're overdriving it on purpose because it makes a crazy sound.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And that really was the start of 60s rock and roll. But there were many other guitar effects which came on the back of that. So things like reverb, already kind of pretty commonly understood. Reverb is essentially emulating the sound of the venue you're playing in. So for example, you may want to recreate the sound of playing in a cathedral or playing in a small club or playing in a studio, those kind of things. You got effects coming around such as really crazy modulation effects like flanges and phasers and weird kind of space sci-fi kind of sounds coming out. Jimi Hendrix famously made use of the wah pedal, so an actual foot pedal which lets you kind of modulate the sound in tune as your foot moves to create crazy effects. And the 1960s was really the era of when guitar effects really came into their own. And what you started finding was that the big name guitarists of the 60s, and you think of the Hendrixes and the Claptons and the Jimmy Pages and the Pete Townsends, they all started creating their signature sounds. And their signature sounds was really based on a combination of a certain kind of guitar, a certain kind of amplifier, possibly a certain kind of speaker system, but certainly a certain combination of guitar effects. And these signature sounds are really quite well-kept secrets. They were closely guarded secrets. So you couldn't just walk out and say, "Oh, I want to sound like Jimi Hendrix today." It's not that easy. We'll come on to how that is a lot easier here in the 21st century. But back then, this was the secret sauce of rock music.
Back when you were talking about the crazy sounds that they were just really fooling around with it, making wild and crazy sounds. I have an album. I only own 12 albums. One of them is called In Sounds from Way Out. And I've got to figure out a way to record a little clip of that for you, because I think you'll appreciate how ridiculous it is from back then.
Okay. So probably the next big evolution in amplification was the move from classic vacuum tubes to solid state amps. So the amps of the 1950s and 1960s were based on what we here in the UK call valves, what you in the US call tubes, those big glass monsters. And they make a very warm sound, but they have challenges in a music, particularly a touring environment. They're heavy. Tube amps are heavy. They're expensive, and they're very, very fragile.
So this was before the invention of the transistor, right?
It is indeed. It is indeed. Yes. So given all these shortcomings of tube-based amps, throwing them in the back of a transit van to go to your next gig is just not a good idea.
Shattered
these
glass.
tube amps wouldn't survive the journey. So guitar roadies would be packing replacement tubes in their bag for these eventualities. But as you say, the transistor came along, revolutionized all kinds of electronics. But just like many other forms of technology, guitar amps went solid state. They went transistor based, and resolved at a stroke all those issues of weight, of expense, and fragility. Now it has to be said that
did they make any change to what you could do with it, or was it simply the portability and reliability of the equipment?
Not really. The changes come later on when everything goes digital. So save that thought for now. We'll get back to that. But it is important to say that tube amps have not completely gone out the window. You can go to your local guitar store now and still buy tube amps.
Really?
So you may ask, well, why? Given all the advantages of transistors, and really, it's probably the analogy would be the kind of people who buy vinyl records versus CDs. So the purists will say that tube amps still have a certain warmth and character about them, which even the best transistor amps have never really been able to fully replicate. I think most of us these days are solid state. We use transistor-based amps, but no, the purists may still prefer the old tube amps.
I am double checking Steve to see if he's making this up, and he is not. I just went to Guitar Center. You could buy a Fender Blues Junior lacquered tweed tube guitar combo amp for $800 today, and it looks like it's from the 1950s.
And that, by the way, I think that I'm going to guess that amp was introduced in the late 50s. It's a classic. As you'll see when we get onto the world of modeling amps, these days you can replicate an amp like that by way of a modern digital amp. But hold that thought again for now.
But how fun is that? I love that still exists.
Indeed. All right. In parallel with all these things changing the world of live music, there's also a revolution going on about the same time in the recording studio. So classic recording studios use tape. Okay, so you stick a microphone or you take a feed directly from your amp and you feed it onto tape. And you'd have things like 8-track studios, 16-track studios. These were the number of individual tracks you could lay down on a piece of tape. And by definition, it's limited. And tape-based recording has got many, many limitations. It's a very labor-intensive process. Editing is very tricky. You can't just go back and change small parts of things you may have recorded. You're limited in terms of the number of tracks. But roundabout, I'm going to guess the 80s saw the evolution and the introduction of the first DAW, the digital audio workstations. And now this is something you'll be familiar with, recording
Yes.
podcasts. Yep.
Yep.
So in the recording studio, it's a close sister to the kind of spoken word tools you would use, but a tool called Pro Tools emerged in the 1980s and pretty quickly became a de facto standard for this new style of digital recording. Non-destructive editing. It's very, very easy to just go back, make changes. Something called comping evolved. Comping is essentially picking the best bits of a recording session and editing it all together into a single final recorded version. You're limited on tracks because everything's digital. It's just hard drive space. You're no longer limited to 8 or 16 tracks. And you get a lot of editing tools. You can do things like pitch correction. So, for example, right. if your singer is just slightly off key, well, there are now tools to correct that. If your drummer is slightly off the beat, you can correct that. There's a wonderful technique called quantization, which will very nicely align everything the drummer does to the perfect beat. This just completely revolutionized the world of studio recording.
Many, many years ago, Shai Yamini, the performer, was on the show, and he talked about the tools that he uses in audio editing and that the things that he could do with this, with changing pitch and beat and all that. And he swears that if I make a recording of me singing, he could make it sound good. And I've never gotten the nerve up to send him a recording, but I still have that in the back of my head that someday I'm going to actually do that.
Yeah. Do it. And by the way, of course, the evolution after the studio-based tools like Pro Tools was into the laptop-based tools. So, I know that you have a slant towards the Mac user base. So people are probably familiar with GarageBand or GarageBand, as I'm sure you call it in America. This was, to use a rather snooty term, the democratization of recording. Yeah. So all of a sudden, you didn't need access to an expensive recording studio to go make a record. You can record it in your bedroom. And we'll get more into this later on because everything has changed. But DAWs have had a fundamental impact on the creation and the distribution.
So would you say that DAWs are what created the garage bands? So apps like GarageBand created garage bands?
Well, the original garage bands were, of course, bands from the 60s who literally threw stuff together in their parents' garage and started playing and recording there. So I think the term predated the Apple product, but anyway.
But I think it was probably a tip of the hat or an homage to that, right?
An homage, indeed. But this was really the tip of the iceberg of the analog to digital revolution. Because in addition to recording tools, amps went digital, and this is where things really do get exciting. So
let me stop you for a second there. So when we talk a lot about analog to digital to analog, 80, DACs, digital audio converters, things like that. But I haven't had anybody on the show who would explain to everybody listening what do you mean by analog versus digital? What does that really mean?
Okay, well,
please use
analog.
Physics. No.
Yeah. Now, come on, you remember I'm a computer science major, not a physics major, Alison. So give me a break here. But well, let me give you an example. So in the probably early 90s to mid 90s, the first digital amps started coming out. And these were amplifiers, which we've said already, they've already gone this evolution of tubes to solid state. Now we start putting CPUs into amps. Now we start putting digital signal processors, DSPs, into amps. Now a DSP is an interesting technology. DSP takes an analog signal, such as you plucking a guitar string, converts it into digital, does some processing, plays around with it, manipulates it in some way, and then converts it back to analog, i.e. a sound, which can come out of a speaker.
So when it's digital, it's just bits. It's
It's
just
bits. It's completely bits and bytes. Yes.
not a
Yes.
continuous wave of something, but bits that it can manipulate. Okay,
And
good, good.
once it's in a digital form, you can do all kinds of stuff with it. And this is where the fun stuff I alluded to earlier really comes into its own. So I've got my guitar amp here. It's packed with computational audio and DSPs. Would it be nice if that amp could replicate that Fender Twin Reverb you just saw in Guitar Center, or any other? You pick your favorite Marshall amp, or you pick your favorite amp from ever, and at the flick of a switch, that amp can replicate the sound you get from a classic tube amp. This is the promise, and in fact, the reality that these modeling amps started delivering in the mid 1990s. And not just that, you can also add in effects. So all the effects I mentioned earlier, which previously the incarnation was a physical pedal you stomped on with your foot. Well, guess what? Now it's just a switch and a digital modeling amp. You probably have your iPhone app, and you can just create whatever selection of whatever amp you choose and whatever selection of effects you want to add before and after it. And there is your sound. And I mentioned earlier on about the secret sauce of these 60s and 70s rock musicians, the signature sound. Well, guess what? Now you can easily replicate those sounds with the touch of a button. And by the way, of course, like most areas, AI is invading this. I've got an app on my phone that goes in my amp. And if I say, hey, I want to sound like Jimi Hendrix on Hey Joe, bam, guess what? AI will pick up exactly the perfect combination of amp and effects pedals to give me that sound.
Wow.
And yep, indeed, this is a lot of fun.
So if it's on your phone, how is that ending up turning into sound coming out to my ear? There's a little gap between an iPhone app and that. What is it telling you? Dial this on your guitar and dial these buttons on in the interface to your amp?
The iPhone app is simply programming the amp. So there's a term. There's a term which is the signal chain. The signal chain for a guitarist is the combination of devices that go between the guitar on one end and the speaker on the other. It's that combination of amplifiers and effects pedals. So when you get into the digital frame, you have a virtual signal chain. You can design this virtual signal chain on your iPhone, press a button, download it into your amp, which then triggers the DSPs appropriately, and magically out comes the sound you want.
So this is pretty crazy. Like, we went from acoustic guitars and then tube amps to this in 100 years. That's astonishing.
Indeed. And by the way, one of the other really fun aspects of this is I talked earlier about this, the democratization of music. Now that we can use these digital modeling amps to create these virtual signal chains and emulate the great guitarists of the past, this has also given rise to a community of tone sharing. So if you create a fantastic sound and you'd like to share it with others, well, guess what? You can pop it up into the cloud, into these sharing sites, and others can download your tones and benefit from your creativity and design work. So
a tone would be like what? What would a tone be?
A tone is this virtual signal chain, a combination of an amp and effects, and maybe possibly also a speaker stack to go with it. But the sound that comes out of a guitar is essentially a tone.
Oh, okay. The whole kit and caboodle here. This entire change to the analog signal to something completely different.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Now, in your little notes you gave me, you said you've got a little miscellaneous category here because we're caught up to the present so far.
Yeah. I've been conscious. I focused just on guitars today, which is an interesting. It's probably the most valuable angle to take. But of course, when things start going digital, then other instruments are affected as well. One of the first obvious ones is the whole world of synthesizers and sampling. So, for example, the earliest electronic keyboards appear in the late 60s, the 70s, things like the Moogs and the ERPs. And all of a sudden, you get the emergence of electronic music in a whole different feel. No longer are you limited by the sound of conventional instruments. Sampling comes along, lets you essentially create mini recordings of anything from spoken word to sound effects, and you can pop them into your music, and all of a sudden you have the evolution of music forms like hip hop and others, which rely heavily on sampling. You get things like drum machines. So, hey, I hate to say this as a drummer, but drummers are relatively easily replaced by technology. Essentially, all we do is sit there banging things, as I said, and creating a beat. And that's pretty easy to replicate with digital technology. So drum machines come around. So,
but they didn't get replaced
sampling,
when drum machines showed up, right?
I'm sorry, say again?
They didn't get drummers didn't get replaced when electronic drums came around. Their drummers are still there.
Not entirely, but in many, many forms of music, you won't find a lot of live drummers anymore. One of the other challenges of recording drums in particular is it's really expensive. So, for example, let's contrast recording drums in a studio with recording, say, a guitar or a keyboard. With a guitar, you run a cable or possibly a mic directly from the amp into your mixing desk. If you want to record drums, you are possibly rigging up as many as 12 to 15 microphones all around the drum kit to capture it authentically. And I'll give you an example, by the way.
I didn't think about that.
So I'll give you an example. I have a drum teacher who's a real purist. He only has acoustic drums, the traditional drums you would have seen on stage. And he eschews all kinds of electronic technology. Now, I've got electronic drums, e-drums at home, which have a number of benefits, primarily for my neighbors, because they're essentially silent. I can bang away to my heart's content, listen to things through my headphone, and it sounds authentic. All my neighbors can hear is the softest patter of stick on drum pad. But from a recording point of view, electronic drums have huge advantages. So I was chatting with my purist drum teacher the other day. He told me he uses 17 microphones to record himself when he's drumming. Well, guess what I do? I run a USB cable out the back.
I'm sorry. I thought you meant automatic replication of drums, not the ability to record an electronic drum. I misunderstood what you meant.
I kind of veered from one to the other, but my point is that given that traditional drum kits are so problematic, it's just another reason why a lot of modern music creators will use a drum machine.
But doesn't that feel completely different to be tapping on a little rubber mat than actually hitting a drum?
Yes, but you're getting to one of the themes I'm getting into later, which is that modern music is a little bit different.
You That's what the youngsters like
these days, Alison.
You probably don't even get a workout, do you?
Probably not. You probably do not. No, indeed. By the way, just before we leave this, I just want to also just mention the effect of technology on vocals. So we talked already about auto-tune, pitch correction. Okay, so you have the out of key singer. You can just make tiny corrections and put him back into tune or her back into tune. But very quickly, pitch correction and auto-tune move from a technical tool to a creative tool. So I know you're not a music fan, but probably the landmark in this regard is a song which I'm sure many of your listeners will know, by Cher, a song called Believe in the late 90s, which really took auto-tune to a whole new level and unleashed the floodgates of auto-tune creativity and crazy vocal effects. So these days you can buy a $200 vocal processing unit, which sits between your microphone and the PA system. And you can do all kinds of crazy things with your vocals. You can add harmonies. You can double up vocals. You can do formant shifting. Now, formant shifting is essentially changing the tone of a vocal. So, for example, a simple example, you could make a male voice sound female or vice versa. All kinds of crazy things you can do with vocals as well. Technology gets everywhere.
I do know that song, by the way.
Oh, God. I do you a huge disservice. I apologize.
No, that's okay. It's a good assumption. I do remember somebody telling me the classic case of being able to auto-tune a voice was David Hasselhoff apparently cannot sing at all, and yet he's got an album where it sounds like he can. I want to say that was that might have been something that Shai told us about, but that was like the classic example of somebody who can't carry a tune.
Well, he's certainly a very popular recording star. For example, in Germany, I know he's very big, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's had some help from technology for sure. Indeed. And by the way, I hate to break any of your recording secrets, Alison, but maybe you use vocal processing yourself. It's nothing to be ashamed of.
Yeah, a little bit, not too much, but yeah, definitely some a little bit of sweetening of the audio, as they say. So, what about you had a note about MIDI? Was there anything about that? I'm not even sure I understand what MIDI is. I know it's an app on my Mac.
MIDI is essentially a protocol which lets you program musical instruments in its very simplest form. It's code, it's computer code. A good example would be, let's say, for example, you create a melody on a MIDI-enabled keyboard. But you'd like to see what that sounds like played by an oboe. Well, MIDI can just convert that into an oboe or one of a million different orchestral sounds. That's just an example of MIDI in action. So MIDI is a technology which is big in the world of keyboards, drums as well to an extent. So, for example, I can record myself playing drums, output my recording via MIDI into my DAW, and then see what my electronic drum kit would sound on a classic 1960s drum kit, or maybe an electronic Roland drum kit or something like that. So it's another way of manipulating your sound using digital technology.
I can sure see how the purists have a problem with this, and yet you can't deny that this allows a lot of creativity that you couldn't have otherwise.
Indeed so, but this is a segue into, if I may, in the best Steve Jobs tradition, please allow me one more thing, Alison.
Okay.
May I make a bold statement?
Yes.
Okay. Modern music is rubbish. Now, I don't care to sound too... I don't kind of sound too much like my parents or too much like Grandpa Simpson shouting at clouds here, but music changed around the start of the 21st century for a few reasons, which I'll mention in a second. And to my mind, there hasn't been a heck of a lot of good music in the last 25 years. And I'll tell you why I think that is. I think there is some reason to believe this is true. There's a couple of reasons. Before I do, I actually want to quote a source and maybe refer your listeners to a very popular YouTuber called Rick Beato, Beato. Rick Beato is a musician and a music producer and a songwriter and a music journalist. He's got a fantastic YouTube channel. And this was a theme he took up just a couple of months ago, and I found it absolutely echoing all of my own thoughts. So I just want to share with you some of the things he said, which I'm completely in tune with. And that there's a couple of big reasons why modern music is rubbish. The first thing is it's too easy to make. So I talked earlier about the democratization of music recording via laptop-based DAWs versus the recording studio. That's great. Anybody can create a song. That's the good news. The bad news is anybody can create a song, and there's an awful lot of rubbish out there. And it's just way too easy. Around about the same time, the music companies stopped signing bands and focused more on solo artists because they were cheaper. The whole economics of the music business got turned upside down. All of it. Why would you spend money signing an expensive rock band and all the expense that goes to recording them when you can find some talented guy sitting in his bedroom with GarageBand recording the next big hit? The economics just favor the solo artists these days, and bands, I'm afraid, have gone out of fashion.
I might be playing right into your hand here because you are calling out that it's more economical to have solo artists, but you've basically just dissed every Swiftie on the planet by saying that modern music is rubbish.
I will stand by that.
But Billie Eilish? I mean, come on.
They're talented artists, but they get a heck of a lot of help from technology. And by the way, I think you know exactly
But
where
does that
this is
make it
going next.
rubbish? But does that make it rubbish just because they got a lot of help from technology?
To my mind, yes, it really does. It really does. We probably don't have enough time to explore why I feel Taylor Swift and Billie Eilish are bland in the extreme. I don't find them exciting at all. And by the way, they get an awful lot of help, those artists and others, from, and you guess where this is going, AI. AI songwriting tools are now very, very common. And yes, the Taylor Swifts and the Billie Eilishes of this world make extensive use of AI songwriting tools. Now, not
So
exclusive.
what? Wait, that doesn't make the music rubbish.
No, that is a brave position to take, Alison.
No, I'm just challenging the supposition that because something was generated with AI, it is therefore rubbish. Because it's a solo artist, it's therefore rubbish. Because they had modern technology, it's therefore rubbish. That's not a direct line. There's not a logical line between those two. It might be rubbish, but drawing that direct correlation or causation, I don't know about that.
Well, okay. So you just pull the rug out beneath every music creator in the world then, because if they can be replaced by a machine, what is the point of making your own music? But
so I didn't say that. I didn't say they can be replaced by a machine. I mean, you could say the exact same, everything you said could be radio recording people to podcasting, right? Because it's been democratized and any joker in her bedroom, whatever, can create a podcast. So there's a lot to choose from, but there are still great podcasts. It doesn't mean that it's rubbish because I've got the technological tools to allow me to do this and I'm not in a fancy recording studio. And it sounds like you're saying the same thing about music.
But you are coming up with the original content for your pods. Now, songwriting is different. So let's break this down to the basic musical theory. Music is 12 notes. Every song is only different from another song, with those 12 notes being arranged in a different fashion.
Except for Indian music.
Well, okay, I'm talking about Western music. Yes, there are different forms of world music. Yes, you are correct.
More notes.
We're in the world of Taylor Swift and Billie Eilish here. So we work in the world of 12 notes and chromatic scales. So this is a perfect topic for AI. So all the artists we talked about are making extensive use of AI. Now, right now, AI is not writing hit records exclusively, but all of these big songwriters will use AI tools. I think the term is ideation. So they'll create an AI-based song and they'll think, I like that chord progression over there. I'll use that. Or I liked that lyric over there. And they steal bits. So the top songwriting teams of today are AI assisted. They are hybrid AI human creations. Now, what's interesting is what happens when AI actually creates a hit record from scratch. Now we get into a legal minefield apart from anything else because who gets paid?
Let's stay off of that. Stay off of that train because that's a whole different topic. And I'm really going to challenge it here. What is to say that AI created song, if it's a hit record, is rubbish? That's all I'm getting to is you may find it offensive that it's not created by a human, but what makes it rubbish? Rubbish is in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, I think that you just like classic rock and that you don't like modern music. I don't think it has anything to do with how it's created.
Okay, well, let's take a step backwards and think about this. How do AI tools create music? Okay, so they have a large language model, right? Where has that large language model come from? It's been populated by decades of recorded music.
Not populated.
It's derivative. AI music is derived from decades of previously recorded music.
Correct. Trained on.
It's not original.
So no coding is original because we're all using GitHub Copilot to write our code.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, we can probably agree to disagree on that. But I just want to give you a statement, which I found very interesting. So I just want to read this paragraph to you. Creative AI tools can be seen as sophisticated plagiarism software as they do not produce genuine original content, but rather emulate and modify existing works by artists subtly enough to circumvent copyright laws. You know what's interesting about that? That was written by ChatGPT.
Sure. I don't know. I'm thinking about the who was it that Ed Sheeran had somebody was saying that he stole their song because it sounded a lot like something they'd written. I believe artists have been stealing each other's ideas. Painters do this. Everybody is in a certain genre at the same time. Everybody paints like so and so at a certain era in time. Same thing happens with music.
Sure.
I think that's a natural progression. But I'm just going to keep contending that doesn't make what you hear rubbish, because rubbish is in the ear of the beholder. People feel good listening to Taylor Swift, right?
By the way, Ed Sheeran was taken to court, and there's many other examples of that beforehand. But
yes, he won
just
in
to
that
finish
one.
my thought, the interesting thing is going to be copyright law has to evolve in this area, because as and when AI does from scratch create a billion-selling hit record, who makes the money?
Oh, yeah.
Is it the guy who created the song? Is it the company that created the AI tools? Or is it the music companies whose back catalogs were used to train the language models? It's a legal minefield.
I understand it's a legal minefield. I would never argue with you on that point. That is well beyond the scope of this. But I'm gonna throw one more way to argue with you about your saying this is rubbish. I'm going to pull back the curtain a little bit. When Steve and I were talking about having this conversation, he had already had this conversation with me, so I knew he was capable of reproducing it. But he wanted a good outline of what he was going to talk about. So what did he do? He went to ChatGPT and had to create an outline for him. And then he picked and chose what pieces of that he wanted to work with, exactly like you just said Taylor Swift or the other artists are doing with their music.
I'm a big fan of AI. It's not for creating music. But by the way, just to finish on the theme of modern music is rubbish, I said there was two reasons. The first is it's too easy to make. The second is it's too easy to consume. So wind the decades back. I know when I was a teenager, I had my paper round. I would save my money up to buy that album I wanted, and I would go home and I'd stick it in my record player in my bedroom and listen to it over and over and over again. And I paid, I don't know, £5-6 an album. Now we're probably talking 3 times that. But of course, music consumption has completely evolved. We went from all the way back from vinyl to 8 tracks to cassettes to CDs to digital downloads. And now, of course, we're in the world of streaming and Spotify. And not only is it very easy to create music, it's very easy to get your music distributed. So I can sit in my bedroom with GarageBand and create my song, and I can upload it to Spotify. A heck of a lot of stuff gets uploaded to Spotify. There's not a lot of quality control on the stuff in Spotify these days. So music has essentially become valueless. And it's to my mind, it's hard to find the good stuff. For $10 a month, I think we've kind of lost a little bit of judgment, shall we say? It's a tricky area.
I can see what you're saying. It's just become diluted, maybe? Is that the word you're looking for?
And I'll give you an example, by the way. Last year, some friends of mine, they have a band. They wrote and recorded an entire album's worth of songs, 11 original songs, and they uploaded them all to Spotify and Apple Music. And just before Christmas, they had their 10,000th stream. And by the way, a stream in Spotify Apple Music term is when it's played for at least 30 seconds. So 10,000 people thought enough of their music to play it. Now, okay, that's not your Taylor Swift.
Or 10,000 plays. Might be 5,000 people twice.
It could possibly be that indeed so, or any combination of the above. Now, that's not Taylor Swift, but I tell you, if I wrote something that 10,000 people listened to, I'd feel pretty happy about it. But do you know what their commission check, their royalty check was from Spotify for 10,000 plays? $40.
Wow.
Between 4 of them.
Wow.
So the whole economics of music is upside down.
Well, I've heard that artists in general have always made more money touring than they make from their albums. That's always been true, right?
It's certainly true today. It may or may not have been true back in the heydays of the 60s, 70s, 80s, but it's certainly true today. The money's in tour and the merchandise.
There you go. All right. Yeah. Well, I want to buy a T-shirt for your band. That's what I want.
Well, we have a name, which you'll be pleased to know was created by AI, called the Titanium Saints.
The Titanium Saints. I was hoping you were going to say Mouse Rat, but that's a whole other story. All right, Steve, I didn't ask you this ahead of time. Do you have any sort of social media presence where people could write to you and tell you that you're brilliant and that everything I said was all wet?
Not really. I guess I'm traditional, but you can always email me at steve@mallard.com, which is easy enough to remember.
All right. Well, I'm sure glad we reconnected, and I had a lot of fun doing this with you, Steve.
It was a blast. Thank you for inviting me, Allison.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Chit Chat Across the Pond. Did you notice there weren't any ads in the show? That's because this show is not ad-supported. It's supported by you. If you learned something, or maybe you were just entertained, consider contributing to the Podfeet podcast. You can do that by going over to podfeet.com and look for the big red button that says Support the Show. When you click that button, you're going to find different ways to contribute. You can donate one time through the big Donate button with a credit card or Apple Pay, or you can use PayPal. If you want to make a recurring contribution, click the Patreon button. Keep in mind, I don't charge Patreon for Chit Chat Across the Pond or Program by Stealth episodes, just once a month for the Nosilicast. That keeps it simple. If you want to contact me for any reason, you can email me at allison@podfeet.com, and you can follow me on Mastodon at podfeet.com/Mastodon. Maybe you want to talk to other Nosillacastaways? You can do that in our Slack group at podfeet.com/Slack. Thanks for listening, and stay subscribed.